In this video, we're going to create a PHP and HTML contact form. The example is going to include all the main concepts that a contact form requires, but it's going to be done as simply and minimalistically as possible. For example, we'll start with an HTML form. It's going to include just an input for email address and a message. When that form is submitted, it's going to validate that data using just PHP, and we're only going to validate for blanks. Once that form has been filled out properly and submitted, we're going to take the data from the form and do an example of sending it off to an email address and an example of adding it to a table in a database. To start, let's actually create a thank you page first. So in your code editor, create a new file called thankyou.html. And in this page, all we're going to have is the basic HTML tags and a thank you message. So that's all we need in this page. When the contact form has been filled out properly and submitted, PHP will redirect our visitor to this page where we can just display a thank you message. Next, we need to create our actual contact form. So in your code editor, create a new file called contactform.php. Now notice the extension on our contact form is PHP. The extension on our thank you page was just HTML. So our thank you page is just displaying our thank you message. It's not going to do anything that requires PHP. However, this page will. So I'm just going to add the basic HTML requirements here and an H1 for our title. And now we need our actual form elements. So I'm going to open up a form and I'm going to add in here an element for our email address. For my email address, I'm going to use a text box. And then for our message, we're going to use a text area. So a text box is meant for one line of input. A text area is meant for multiple lines of input. And finally, we just need a submit button. So if I save that and open up my local host and open up my contact form, that's what we have so far. Now next, we need to give each of our form elements a name. So I'm going to call our email address input email and our text area message. When the visitor provides data for these two form elements and clicks submit, the data will be saved in a PHP array using whatever names we provided as the array keys. Also, I need to specify how this form is going to be submitted. So when this form is submitted, the browser will take the form data and submit it, in this case, to itself. It's going to submit the form data to contactform.php using the post method. Now, at this point, let's just see what our form data looks like. So I'm going to use a function called printr. This function is great for taking a complex variable like an array and just outputting it on the screen so we can see what's inside that variable. So I'm going to wrap the post array with these pre-tags. It just helps make it a little bit easier to read. So now if I fill this out and provide a message and click submit, this is the contents of our post variable. So you can see all the information I provided using the form elements is now inside a post variable, which is a PHP array using keys that I specified in my form elements. Our next step is to validate the data provided by the visitor in our form. Now, when you're validating data with PHP, you have to approach it differently than JavaScript. With JavaScript, because the language is a client-side language and it's running in the browser, you can react to a visitor pressing the submit button. A visitor presses the submit button, your JavaScript can check the data before the form submits. However, with PHP, you can't do that. So we're going to let the form submit with or without valid data. PHP is then going to check the data and then either redirect the visitor to a thank you page if the data is good, and if the data is not good, it's going to give the visitor the opportunity to fix it. However, because the page is going to reload, we have to make sure that any data the visitor has filled out stays in the form elements when the page reloads. So I'm going to take out my testing code here, and I'm going to create a variable called email. In this variable, I'm going to place the email address provided by the visitor from the form. However, if I reload our page, because the form is not yet submitted, that email variable doesn't exist. So before I take the email from the form and put it in a PHP variable, I'm going to check to make sure it exists. If it exists, I am going to put that into our email variable. If it does not, I'm going to set our email variable to nothing. Now, this line here might be new to some PHP programmers. It's an inline if statement. So this question mark and this colon, together these three pieces make up an if statement. It's basically saying if this is true, so this is my condition, then use this, otherwise use that. So it's a quick way of creating an if statement that kind of has one or an alternative outcome. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing with my message. And then to maintain my email and message provided from my visitor, I'm going to use my value attribute and put my email in the value of the email text box. And in the text area, you don't use value, you place it in between the open and closed text area tag. And now if I refresh, there's my form, no errors. If I fill this out and click submit, okay, notice my email address stayed there. I must have a mistake with my message. Yes, I just spelled post wrong here. So save that, we'll try that again. Okay, so now my form is maintaining any contributions from our visitor. That way the visitor doesn't have to restart the form from scratch because they made one mistake with one form element. Now let's validate that data. So I'm going to create two more variables, one called email error, and one called message error. I'm going to default them to empty. That way, just like with the previous error variables, I don't get undefined errors. And then I'm going to check to see if the form has submitted. So there's many ways to check, but I can tell that the form has been submitted because there are items in my post array. So when the page first loads, that post array is empty. When the visitor clicks submit, now that post array will have two keys in it, email and message. Even if the form has been left blank, those values will exist. They'll just be empty. So I can just say if count post, basically saying if there is anything in my post form variable, I can now validate. While I'm validating, I want to know how many errors I found. So I'm going to create a variable here called errors and set it to 0. And now let's validate. Now at this point, I'm just going to validate for blanks. So if my email address is blank, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to add one to errors, and I'm going to take my email error variable and place an error message in it. Okay, same thing for message. So if message is blank, I'm going to add one to errors, and I'm going to take my message error variable and put an error message in it. And then after each of my form elements, I'm going to output the related error. So under my email text box, I'm going to output my email error. And under my message text box, I'm going to output my message error. So if I save and submit, okay, data is maintained and there's no error messages. However, if I leave them both blank and click submit, we get our email address error and our message error. The next piece we want to add is if the form is submitted with good data, we want to respond with our thank you message. And for now, let's just take our contact form submission content and save it to our database. So first thing we need is a new table. So I'm going to open up my PHP MyAdmin tool and create a new table called, I'll just call it contact, with 4 columns. And my 4 columns are going to be an ID. My ID is going to be my primary key, and it's going to auto increment. I'm going to have my email address, which is going to be variable character, and I think 100 characters should be enough. Then my message, and my message can be text. And then finally, I'm going to add a date, and this is just going to be the date that the form was submitted. Now I don't need to worry about this in my code. I can default this to the current timestamp. So when a contact form submission is submitted and the database table receives a new record, that record will automatically take the current time and place it in my date column. And save. So now in my code, I'm going to connect to my database, so we'll just throw that right up at the top. And my host is localhost the default MAMP username and password is root, and the database name I'm using is sandbox. And right here, I want to add my new record. However, I only want to add this record if the data was valid. So that's what this errors variable is. If errors equals equals 0, that means we found no errors when validating our form content. So here, I can run my insert. So insert into contact. And I need to specify which fields I want to fill. So I want to fill the email address field, and I want to fill the message field. I want to fill the email address with my email variable, and my message with my message variable. Now, there is a chance that the email address or message provided by our visitor contains characters that might mess up our SQL statement. For example, quotes. Any quotes in there will often cause problems. So a quick fix is to just take our two variables and run them through the PHP add slashes function. This function will add slashes in front of any characters that might cause problems. Now this isn't going to fix everything, but for this example, let's call it enough. Finally, I'm going to execute my query. And then I want to redirect our visitor to the thank you page. Now for now, let's just take a look at our query. And we'll run a die statement. So if I go back to my contact form and fill this out and click submit. Okay, so I'm getting an error message, undefined message, errors. So I'm just missing an S there. That should be errors. And let's refresh. So if errors is 0, which it was because I provided data for both of my inputs, here is my insert query. So it's going to insert into my contact table. We're going to fill the email and message columns with this email address and this message. So that looks good. I did execute my query. So if I just jump over to my database and hit browse, I can see that I have a couple records from testing. So I can take out this, and I want to redirect the visitor to my thank you page. So the code for that is that I add a header, and the header I'm adding is location, and it's going to redirect my visitor to the thank you page. Now I have seen some servers where after you add a header, like a location header, it's good to just run a die statement just to stop your code from executing further. So if I go back here and submit again, we don't even see that process where the form elements are added to my database. It just redirects to my thank you page. And if I go back to my database and hit browse, there's now an additional record. Now, lastly, what I can do is I can also take this and send it to an email address. So I'm going to create a message for myself. You have received a contact form submission. So remember, this email is going to me. I want to know who filled out my contact form and what their message was. So I'm going to create a message with those elements. And then PHP has a function called mail. It's a very simple way to send an email to an email address. So in here, I would put my email. my subject, and my message. Now there are many other options you can add to this mail function, but this is the bare minimum. That is not my email address, so this isn't going to work. Also, I'm currently running my code locally and I do not have the mail set up on my PHP server. So this actually won't work at this point, but that is the code to send a quick email off to an email address. So this way, when someone fills out your contact form, you get a copy of that in your database and you get an email in your inbox. Now, again, this code is very simple. There's probably security holes all over the place. The mail that this function is going to send is likely going to go to your junk folder, but I just wanted to get the concepts across so that you can have a contact form from start to finish working with lots of room for improvement, much better validation, more form elements, but it's a starting point.